Welcome to God's Word Speaks. I'm Lee. In this episode, we're going to look at the so-called Synoptic Problem and why we have multiple Gospels. So this week, I'm taking a break from the 1689 Confession study. I'll get back to chapter 3 of the Confession either next week or the week after. I'm not quite sure just yet. But this week, I wanted to discuss a topic in biblical studies, which deals with the four Gospels of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Often you may hear their fuller titles, such as the Gospel according to Matthew or according to Mark, etc. But have you ever wondered why we have four Gospels? Why not just one? It would certainly make biblical studies a lot simpler. And who wrote first? Did the Gospel writers use each other's works in their writing? These issues are very often centered around just the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because they are so similar. These three are collectively known as the Synoptic Gospels. The word synoptic means seeing together. But they're called this, again, because they have so much commonality between them, between Matthew and Luke, and then Mark being shorter overall. Despite their similarities, there's also many differences between them. Most are minor, but some can be a bit confusing. And of the synoptics, Mark is the redheaded stepchild of the bunch because it is so much shorter in length, being only 16 chapters versus 23 and I believe 24. But it's much shorter, punchier, but yet in the events that it does have, it has more details than Matthew and Luke. And then John is kind of off doing his own thing altogether. He doesn't really line up well with either of the other three. Though there are some common events between John and the Synoptics, John's Gospel is very much in a category of its own. Now, I'll admit that this is more of a fun topic than something dealing with doctrine or theology in particular. This is one of those conversations that Christians have over coffee or Diet Coke, where one lands in this area really has no effect on how Christians see each other, or to even extent how we interpret the Gospels. It certainly can impact our background studies and how we understand the Gospels in a human perspective, how they came about, but the content doesn't really change depending on how we understand the historical background of these. A lot of this discussion is speculation, unfortunately. And at the end of the day, we can all affirm as believers that the Gospels are Holy Scripture. They are breathed out by God and are accurate recordings of the actions and sayings of our Lord during his earthly ministry. I do find theological significance in the nature, number, and writing order of the Gospels. But if others don't, it's not a big deal. And also remember that this discussion is attempting to ascertain the human means by which God worked. Why are there four Gospels? Ultimately because God ordained it. But God works through means, and that's what we're attempting to figure out when we discuss this synoptic problem and really the quote-unquote problem of multiple Gospels altogether. So the synoptic problem is the label given to this area of study, again, specifically on the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Why do we have the Gospels that we have? Why are three of them so close and yet so different? And in what order were they written? Did they use each other as sources in their own work? These questions are very intertwined. So let's first focus on the question of who wrote first. And that really kind of leads its way into the other areas of discussion here. So the current prominent views are split between Markian and Matthean priority. So whether Mark or Matthew were written first. There are some fringe views that Luke or John wrote first, but they are not very popular and have very little, if any, historical support. Now, to lay my cards on the table from the beginning of this discussion, I hold to a Matthean priority theory known as the fourfold gospel hypothesis. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But this was advocated by Dr. Bernard Archard and made accessible by Dr. David Allen Black's book, Why Four Gospels? I certainly commend that to anyone who wants some more in-depth discussion and sources on all of this. I find their arguments very compelling, and Dr. Black does an excellent job of connecting this historical question with the redemptive plan that God executed with the new covenant. Now, before I go much further, I also want to acknowledge a sad fact and give a warning to those who wish to dive into the quote-unquote scholarly side of biblical studies. If this piques your interest and you start looking for other resources, just be aware that sadly much of modern biblical scholarship has been taken over by so-called Enlightenment thinking, which has plagued biblical studies with unbelieving people attempting to study a living, breathing book, which of course has a divine author. And because of this, modern scholars push the dates so far past the ministry of Jesus and the lives of the apostles into the late 1st and even early 2nd centuries that claims of corruption or reliance on second-hand accounts are very common. This then gives them grounds to claim that the Gospels were not actually written by the apostles or their companions, and were in fact written by later generations. As believers, we can say confidently that this is nonsense. From our earliest records, the Gospels have always been attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and John being eyewitness apostles to the ministry of Jesus. Luke is always associated with Paul, the apostle to the Gentiles, and Mark is always associated with Peter, again, another eyewitness apostle testament to Jesus' life. There's never been a question about the authors, and there's no good reason to start now. All it does, when we attempt to push these later dates, when we attempt to question the authorship and all that, all it does is attempt to strip these books of their divine authorship by casting doubt on what they record. There is no scholarly or historical reason to do this other than to make people doubt the Christian faith. That's not to say that we must reject everything that comes out of these schools of thought and from these individuals, but rather that we should be cautious and remember that everything is theological, even if people are not overt about it. It's about understanding when to take the meat and to spit out the bones. So from the beginning, we're coming at this from a historical, but more importantly, a believing Christian perspective. So let's first look at the Mark first view. This is the most popular one, and so I want to kind of lay the groundwork of this is what is believed by many, even in believing conservative circles. So the modern scholarship is actually divided a little bit when it comes to the synoptics, regarding the questions of who wrote first, who depended on whom, what their sources were, why one author has more details than another. There actually is not a very clear consensus on a specific theory. And there's a lot of them, even within Mark first or Matthew first, Mark priority, Matthew priority. Even within those two camps, there's different theories of how they were written. And there's really no consensus. Though there are a few popular theories, scholars and theologians do remain split on this issue. And there are many believing Christian scholars on various sides of this issue as well. The current majority view, especially in scholarly circles, is that Mark wrote first, followed by Matthew, then Luke, and lastly, John. So we'll look at a few arguments for Markian priority, then arguments for Matthean priority. And I'll leave you to decide which is more convincing. The arguments for Mark assume that Matthew and Luke are directly referencing Mark and using him as a source, as a sort of base text, and then extending on it. So first is a linguistic argument. The Greek of Mark is quite rough and quick compared to Matthew and Luke's, which is much cleaner and more polished. It certainly shows signs of someone who either had Greek as their first language or what used it so often that they were well versed in the Greek language. And remember at this time as well that in the Roman Empire, there were multiple languages in every area. Latin was certainly the prevailing language, as that was the language of Rome, and so that was would have been the language of the Roman Empire overall. But because of the influences of Alexander the Great, Hellenistic Greek was also very prominent, especially on the eastern part of the Roman Empire. In Palestine, at this time, Israel would have been in that sphere of having been under Greek rule and then coming under Roman rule. Koine Greek or Common Greek was very popular, very common, and would very often be used in addition to Latin as a kind of lingua franca of multiple different groups trying to communicate with each other. And on top of that, you also have the local languages. So the Jewish population would have been primarily speaking Aramaic at this point, knowing some Hebrew because of the scriptures. The scriptures were always written, at least in the Jewish communities, or very typically spoken and remembered in Hebrew, and would have been recited in Hebrew, although their day-to-day language would have been Aramaic. So it's very possible for someone in that part of the Roman Empire to know 2, 3, even 4 different languages. So, for example, Matthew, being a tax collector, not only was he of Jewish descent, so he would have known Aramaic, very possibly Hebrew to an extent, but he would have also been well-versed in Greek because of having to deal with the government of doing his taxes. Luke, of course, would have been well-versed in Greek because he was a Gentile. He was not a Jew. And so Greek was most likely his first language. But understanding that there's these multiple languages in play in this, especially in this area where the apostles were, at least the Jewish apostles were primarily working, actually helps to understand a little bit about Mark. And we'll talk about that more a bit later on. So the Greek of Matthew and Luke is very clean, very polished. They are from a hand and or mouth, if being recorded, of someone who knew the language very well, either as their mother tongue or as a very early second language. So the argument goes that since an author commonly smooths over their source material, Matthew and Luke would have came later since their Greek is smoother than Mark's. If Mark came later, assuming he relied on Matthew and or Luke, the question then arises of why he didn't maintain the better Greek of his source material. And related to this linguistic argument is another one regarding Mark's preservation of Aramaic terms. Mark often records the Aramaic words of Jesus along with a Greek translation. So this, according to scholars, points to an early authorship which more closely preserves the quote-unquote original voice of Jesus. And Jesus very likely would have been speaking Aramaic the vast majority of the time. He very possibly knew Greek as well, certainly would have known Hebrew, but Aramaic would have been his day-to-day language, especially to the Jewish people. And so the idea is that Mark is preserving this Aramaic voice of Jesus. If Mark were last, why would he maintain these Aramaic terms? And this also connects with the modern view that the Gospels, at least Matthew, Luke, and John, were written much later in the first century. By that time, it would make sense that the other Gospel writers would dispel of Aramaic hangovers, as the church had been largely Gentile at that point. So the idea is that Mark preserves these pieces of Aramaic, but then Matthew and Luke, writing later, would have removed those Aramaic leftovers. And the third argument is regarding content. Mark is obviously much shorter than Matthew and Luke. If Mark were an abridged version of the other two, why would he remove important pericopes, such as the birth narratives, the Sermon on the Mount, or the Lord's Prayer? But at the same time, why would Mark have additional details in the events he did write that weren't in the preceding accounts? The argument is that it makes more sense that Matthew and Luke added to and cleaned up Mark's accounts rather than the reverse. Now, there are other arguments, but these give a good overview of the position. The problem with these arguments and others is that they can be easily explained by Mark's relationship with Peter and the circumstances around Mark's writing, which Clement and Origen mention, and don't necessarily point to Mark being written first. A common theory within the Markian priority camp is what's called the two-source hypothesis. This says that Mark was written first, then Matthew and Luke each expanded on Mark, either independently or closely together, by using a different document that is simply called Q. This Q document is believed to be a written document of the actions and sayings of Jesus that Matthew and Luke consulted in writing their own Gospels. The problem is that we have no such evidence of a so-called Q document. There is nothing mentioned in the Church Fathers about such a document, and we have no manuscript evidence of it. If such a document existed, one would think that it would have been preserved by the early church. There are other theories that don't require Q, but this is a popular one. However, I believe there's a better and simpler explanation if we assume that Matthew was instead the first written gospel. What about the patristic evidence? What do the early church fathers say about this? The writings of the early church can shed some light on this topic. Among the church fathers, there's slight variation, but there is a common theme. In Book 6 of Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, he records that Clement of Alexandria believed that the order was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Quote, Clement gives the tradition of the early presbyters as to the order of the Gospels in the following manner. The Gospels containing the genealogies, he says, were written first. Unquote. The only two Gospel accounts that contain genealogies are Matthew and Luke. He goes on to talk about the circumstances of Mark's composition being the recordings of Peter's teaching in Rome, but we'll get to that in a moment. In the same book of Eusebius, he records that Origen believed that the order was Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, like we have in our current Bibles. Quote, in his first book on Matthew's Gospel, Maintaining the Canon of the Church, he testifies that he knows only 4 Gospels written as follows. Among the 4 Gospels, which are the only indisputable ones in the Church of God under heaven, I have learned by tradition that the first was written by Matthew, the second is by Mark, the third by Luke, and last of all, that by John. Unquote. There are some parts I left out of Origen's description of the Gospels, but again, we'll come back to that in a moment. Irenaeus also records the history of the Gospels. In his writing against heresies, he writes, For after our Lord rose from the dead, they went out into the ends of the earth, bearing the good tidings of the blessings we have from God, and announcing to men heavenly peace. Now these, all and each of them alike, having the gospel of God. Matthew, for his part, published also a written gospel among the Hebrews in their own language, whilst Peter and Paul were at Rome, preaching and laying the foundation of the church. And after their departure, Mark, Peter's disciple and interpreter, did himself also publish unto us in writing the things which were preached by Peter. And Luke too, the attendant of Paul, set down in a book the gospel preached by him. Afterwards John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned on his breast, he again put forth his gospel while he abode in Ephesus in Asia. So again, we have evidence of the order Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Notice that in the writings of the early church, whenever this topic is mentioned, Matthew is always first on the list, and John is always last. Luke and Mark, however, get swapped around a few times in the middle. This indicates that there was a common belief about the order of the Gospels, and we'll soon see the purpose of the Gospels. With this patristic evidence, does a traditional Matthean priority view make sense? It absolutely does. So now I'm going to get specifically into the fourfold gospel hypothesis. This is what David Allen Black calls this. He says the name that he's suggested to kind of differentiate it, because this is an evolution of another Matthew first theory that attempts to kind of flesh out more of the historical circumstances of the writing of the Gospels, especially based on how Clement and Origen describe the writing of Mark. So first, let's look at Matthew. As mentioned earlier, Eusebius records that both Clement and Origen believed that Matthew was written first. Now, from a theological perspective, this fits perfectly. After all, as Paul writes, the gospel was to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And Matthew is a very Jewish gospel from the very beginning. From the first chapter, he heavily quotes the Old Testament to point its fulfillment in Jesus. He uses Jewish terms and themes to show that Jesus was the Messiah foretold long ago, and Acts can be a great guide here. The first half of Acts is all about the gospel message being proclaimed to the Jews in Jerusalem and the surrounding region. It's not until years later that focus changes to the Gentiles, with Peter's visit to Cornelius and later Paul's own conversion. Matthew would be the perfect evangelical tool since the apostles can't be everywhere at once. So why not commission one of the 12 to make a written account of the highlights of Jesus' ministry? It's also interesting to note that Matthew and Luke are about the length of a commercial scroll at that time, which is around 30 feet, which means that these were written specifically to be published and used among the churches. These were not just a personal recording, but specifically meant to be distributed amongst the people. So Origen corroborates this by saying, I've learned by tradition that the first was written by Matthew, who was once a publican, tax collector, but afterwards an apostle of Jesus Christ, and it was prepared for the converts from Judaism and published in the Hebrew language. There's an interesting comment by Irenaeus, Clement, and Origen, the first two being quoted by Eusebius, that Matthew was written in Hebrew, a Hebrew language, Hebrew characters, Hebrew dialect. Perhaps that's a topic that I can dive into later, but for now we simply say, regardless of the first writing, the gospel that God has preserved in history is Matthew's version in Greek. And to that we make our final appeal as Holy Scriptures, and just leave it at that for the moment. But this does explain Matthew's gospel and why he would have been the first to write. Of course, the gospel was going amongst the Jews first, and the focus was in Jerusalem and to Israel. So now we turn our attention to Luke. So why Luke? If there was already a perfectly good recording of Jesus' life and teachings in circulation, why the need for another? Well, think again about Acts and the greater redemptive story. What was the major turning point of the early church? What was the bombshell moment? It was the inclusion of the Gentiles, a people that knew nothing of Jewish religion, history, or practice. And perhaps this was the initiative for the Greek version of Matthew, but even so, Matthew's gospel is still very Jewish, whether it was originally written in Hebrew, and certainly the Greek version we have. The Gentiles probably had a difficult time understanding it because of its rich Hebrew background. This makes sense when we also remember who Luke was associated with, Paul. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, and Luke often accompanied him. In Acts, you can see there's various we sections and then third-person sections. So you can tell when Luke was present with Paul and when he wasn't. Their mission and work was primarily among the Gentiles. They no doubt had a copy of Matthew during his journeys, maybe even multiple to give to churches as they were established. But they would have been the first to experience the pain points of using Matthew's Jewish gospel to evangelize non-Jewish people. Not that it wasn't impossible, because obviously we use Matthew today as Gentiles in both exposition and in preaching and proclamation to other Gentiles. But there are certainly parts in it that one really needs a good grasp of the Old Testament background to fully understand and appreciate. So what do? Luke takes it upon himself, probably at the behest of Paul, to write basically a Gentile version of Matthew, a version that keeps the details, events, and sayings of Jesus, but removes or changes the overtly Jewish, Hebraic, and Aramaic terms and phrases. For example, in the Olivet Discourse of Matthew 24:15, Matthew says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. While Luke basically fills in that let the reader understand part for the Gentiles. Because in his version, Luke 21:20, he writes, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that its desolation has come near. And Luke dedicates his gospel and his Acts of the Apostles to a man named Theophilus. Perhaps he was the final catalyst that pushed Luke to write his version. And Luke was no slouch. Though he used Matthew as a starting point, he did his own homework. As his prologue says, Luke 1:1-4, many have undertaken to compile a narrative about the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as the original eyewitnesses and servants of the word handed them down to us. So it also seemed good to me, since I have carefully investigated everything from the very first, to write to you in an orderly sequence, most honorable Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things about which you have been instructed. So if Luke was going to take on this project, knowing full well the weight and reception that Matthew's gospel already had, he needed to be sure that everything he wrote was accurate. But Luke's gospel had a problem. Neither Luke nor Paul were eyewitnesses to Jesus' earthly ministry. Paul was taught directly by Jesus right after his conversion, but he wasn't part of the original 12. This could potentially cast doubt upon Luke's work, if not by the Gentile churches, more so by the Jerusalem church, who for so long at this point had been disseminating Matthew's gospel. An eyewitness approval was needed to ensure that Luke's gospel was accepted. So now we turn to Mark. Mark is this approval. An interesting piece of evidence is that Eusebius records from Clement of Alexandria, about the writing of Mark. He is the one who says that the Gospels with the genealogies were written first. And Eusebius continues recording Clement, saying, "The Gospel according to Mark had this occasion. As Peter had preached the word publicly at Rome and declared the Gospel by the Spirit, many who were present requested that Mark, who had followed him for a long time and remembered his sayings, should write them out, and having composed the Gospel, he gave it to those who had requested it. When Peter learned of this, he neither directly forbade nor encouraged it." And in his commentary on 1 Peter, Clement's commentary, he writes, "Mark, the follower of Peter, while Peter publicly preached the gospel at Rome before some of Caesar's equates and adduced many testimonies to Christ, in order that thereby they might be able to commit to memory what was spoken by Peter, wrote entirely what is called the gospel according to Mark." I mentioned this earlier, but it bears repeating that whenever Mark is mentioned in the patristic sources, especially in relation to the gospel in his name, it is always associated with Peter. Other sources such as Irenaeus, Eusebius in Book 2, Papias of Hierapolis, and Jerome also note that Mark's gospel was a product of Peter's memoirs and published either with Peter's knowledge or after his death. There is some discrepancy and some ambiguity there. When one reads Mark against Matthew and Luke, it becomes apparent that Mark is a zigzag compilation of the other two. Understanding this and the circumstances surrounding its composition, a probable hypothesis is that Peter, while in Rome, around the same time as Paul, possibly in prison, gave lectures to a Roman audience, perhaps consisting of both Christians and non-Christians, and Clement remarks that some of Caesar's household were in attendance here. But during these lectures, he used scrolls of Matthew and Luke to give his lectures. According to Clement, Peter's audience wanted a written copy of what Peter was saying. So Mark, or other scribes, with Mark coming in afterwards, wrote down Peter's speeches to give to the people. This provides a simple explanation for all the quirks of Mark. Its rough Greek and its Aramaic leftovers are explained by Peter himself. Greek wasn't his native language, but being in Rome, he was doing his best speaking in the lingua franca of the day, so naturally his second, or perhaps even third, language would be a bit rough, and his native tongue of Aramaic would peek through from time to time. After all, he was born and raised in Galilee. His first language would be Aramaic. The Greek he would only learn later. And most likely he only honed his Greek once he had to deal with the Gentiles coming into the church. The quickness of Mark is also explained by the way Peter was doing his lectures. Assuming he was following Matthew and Luke, he was going from event to event where he had been both physically present and remembered the details of the occasions. This also explains why Mark, though it has fewer pericopes, has more details overall. Peter would naturally be adding detail that Matthew and Luke did not have. So from a human perspective, Mark wasn't meant to be another gospel in competition to Matthew or Luke. It was simply the recording of Peter's speeches for his audiences. But it proved so valuable in the providence of God that it was compiled as a single work and distributed, not as competition, but as a bridge. The gospel started with the Jews in Jerusalem. It expanded to the Gentiles, and the church had to deal with this inclusion. We see this in Acts 15 in the Jerusalem Council. The question was, what do we do with the Gentiles? The written gospels reflect this very struggle. Matthew was first as the gospel to the Jews. Luke was written second as the gospel to the Gentiles. And then Mark was the bridge connecting the two. The church is a unification of Jew and Gentile as one people for God. And the written Gospels are a literary embodiment of this. In the patristic evidence, the overwhelming view is that Matthew wrote first and John wrote last. There's some switching between who wrote second and third. But this theory even makes sense of those differences. If Paul was wanting to acquire eyewitness approval of Luke's version, he would not have wanted to distribute it too widely until such approval was given. So from one perspective, the order Matthew, Luke, Mark makes sense because that was the order of physical writing. But the order Matthew, Mark, Luke also makes sense because this was the order of publication. Both orders can be correct depending on how one views it. So for me, this fourfold gospel hypothesis provides a satisfactory answer to the so-called synoptic problem. With this perspective, there is no problem, as all three fit naturally together, while John provides a capstone on the story of Jesus' earthly ministry by providing additional details and events that Matthew and Luke did not have. John is not redundant, but complementary. I find this theory the most probable of any others. It correlates the best with the patristic evidence without requiring twisting of their writings. It explains the similarities and differences of Mark compared to Matthew and Luke, and it fits a theological purpose by fitting the structure of Acts and the inclusion of the Gentiles and all that was required in rethinking God's work in the world. But as I mentioned at the beginning, if you disagree with this theory, that's perfectly fine. If anything is a third-tier issue, it is absolutely this. Does one's interpretation of the Gospels depend on their order of composition or dependence? No, not at all. I think it adds to the historical background and is a very interesting detail, but it ought not impact one's interpretation of the text itself. Regardless of who wrote first, we can use all three, and sometimes four, to compare and get a full picture of the earthly life of Jesus. And for that, we can give all glory, praise, and thanksgiving to God. So I hope you found this topic interesting. I certainly did. It's just, it's one of those fun topics that people don't maybe really think about very often. And perhaps you never thought about this before, and this is another rabbit hole that you can explore. I will put the bibliographical information for Dr. Black's book in the show notes if you'd like to pick up a copy and read his explanation. He provides additional support that I didn't include for the sake of time, and does a very good job of laying out the issues, both of what he believes are the discrepancies of the Mark first view, and then the additional support of the Matthew first view. If you have any questions or comments about this, please send them to me. You can add a comment on the post for this episode or to the email in the show notes. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and I will see you next time on God's Word Speaks.